Okay, so we're going to go on to look at, particularly at attention. So I want to focus on ways we can apply some of these general principles I was talking about, or general ways of working that I was talking about in the first section, particularly to the question of our attention. So perhaps I can start with an example of a psychological experiment which has become quite famous, and there's a book about it and so on. But there was an experiment where people were asked to observe a basketball game, and they were given a very specific task, which I think was counting the number of passes that people made in the basketball game. And during this basketball game, with the basketball game continuing uninterrupted, a man in a gorilla suit walked into the middle of the basketball court and did a little dance and then walked off again. And quite a large proportion of the people who'd been tasked with counting the number of passes and intensely focusing on observing the basketball game did not notice the man in the gorilla suit. So this is a very interesting demonstration of the limitations of attention, that basically what may be, in a sense, in front of our eyes, which we might normally expect to perceive and understand and recognise, we may not. It's not going to come to our attention, and the ways in which our attention is very much framed by or determined by our goals, by what we want, what we're trying to achieve, and indeed our representations of those goals I was talking about earlier. So we've got a particular fixed idea in our, particularly in our left brains, in an idea of what it is we want to do, and that actually determines not just our beliefs about what we're doing, but actually what we experience in the first place, or what we recognise or give our attention to in the first place. So attention is, I think, quite a good place to start in thinking about the effects of cognitive biases particularly, and the sorts of things we need to work with, because it's sort of the starting point in our relationship to the world. Before we form beliefs about things, we have to recognise them and to experience them. So there's there's a selectivity in our attention, and you could see, we could break this down perhaps a little bit into some different elements that are making our attention limited in various ways. So first of all, there's the fact that we are in a specific location. So I'm not just in anybody's barn, I'm sitting on a particular chair in the meeting room of anybody's barn. And my body's in a particular position, and all that limits what I can experience. I don't even know what's going on the other side of the building, maybe. There's quite a few things in this room that I may not even be aware of, because I'm here rather than there. And that's obviously a physical limitation we all have to work with. And I'm in that location because of the fact that we've arranged this retreat, and I've become involved in this retreat, which is due to my previous choices and previous actions and previous situations. So our location isn't just something we're landed with, it's interlocked with our goals and processes and the things that we have wanted to do previously, and maybe our intentions for the future as well. Then there's the limitations of our senses. So, and this is a really interesting one from the point of view of skeptical arguments about what we don't know. So obviously we have human senses with limited detection abilities on limited frequencies. Our ears can only pick up sound waves on certain frequencies, or eyes can only pick up light waves on certain frequencies, and so on. So, for example, there may be an alien over there who only emits any kind of evidence of his or her existence or its existence on infrared spectrum might be sitting over there observing us, and we wouldn't know anything about this alien. This is a possibility. It's probably not very likely, but we can't rule it out for certain. So our limited senses, can just make us unaware of things which are actually quite crucial might be going on. If you think about, this can be of practical importance if you think about things like that's ways in which animals can become aware of earthquakes and phenomena like that, where animals can illustrate that have different senses and sensory abilities can illustrate our own limitations. And then there's the direction of our senses. So obviously, particularly only having eyes on the front of my head, being a human, I can only really look in one direction at once. I have pretty poor peripheral vision compared to a horse or some kind of herbivorous animal, which is looking more broadly for danger. But any animal or any embodied creature has limited directionality, and we can't see what we're not actually focusing on in some senses. But then, perhaps most importantly here, there's the sensitivity and selectivity of our senses. So, I may have working senses that trend in the right direction, but they still may not be sensitive enough to pick up what's important to me at that particular moment. And that perhaps seems to be more obvious in things like signs of people's emotions and so on that we may not spot if we're not tuned into them, those sorts of things. We may be able to see a person's face, but we still may not be able to interpret it in the way we need to. And the selectivity, we saw that illustrated by the experiment with the man in the gorilla suit, that when we're focused on one thing, then we phase out or rule out others. So we're quite limited in that sense. And then, but that's just really about the senses and how our attention can enable us to spot things and recognise things through the senses. But then there's also a question of what we actually recognise and process and respond to and do something about. And that depends not just on these limitations with senses, but also other things. So there's factors like availability to us. So what can we actually think about? What's mentally available to us for us to be aware of. What is salience, what is relevant to our purposes. So in the case of the gorilla suit experiment, the gorilla was not salient to the people involved in that experiment who were counting the passes, so they didn't choose to focus on or look for the man in the gorilla suit. And then there's domain dependence. It's a very interesting one, I think, in that we get into certain habits and ways of thinking about what we experience. So due to our habits, in effect, we only really experience and engage with things which are in the domain that we expect to engage with. So there's a great example there of a professor of decision theory. This is an anecdote, I don't know how true it is, but a professor of decision theory is an expert on decisions, but he's used to dealing with them in a kind of corporate context. So he can go into great detail, weighing up the pros and cons and the elements that might enable, say, a company to make a difficult decision. But then he has a personal decision to make. Should he apply for this other post in this other university? And he's angsting about this and he can't make up his mind. And some colleagues suggest, well, why don't you apply decision theory? He says, no, I can't do that. It's not in the domain that he's accustomed to use his analysis in, so therefore he doesn't use it. This can happen quite often in the way that we don't do things that might seem obvious, someone else might spot, from a slightly wider perspective because we're used to specialising in a particular domain which we become dependent upon. Then there were some cognitive biases which I think are quite, well, they're universal really. They apply to all of us to some extent in terms of limitations of our attention. It's the primacy effect I mentioned earlier this morning. So, primacy effect is first impressions count. So this could apply not just to a person. Most obviously, the first impression we have of a person tends to give us a label or a set of labels that are most important to us when we think about that person and make judgments about them. So hence the widespread idea that what you do in the first few seconds when you walk into an interview room is what decides whether you get the job or not anything that you say after that. Now there may be a bit of complexity to that. That may not be completely correct, but that's there's some truth in it probably. And that can also be the case with if you think about an unidentified animal. Your first idea about what that brownish streak on four legs might be is probably the thing you're likely to stick with. Though it's possible you can change it subsequently, but we have an initial impression which we then use as a basis of judgment, but we may be wrong. Another one is the recency effect, which I gather is a bit less important to us than the primacy effect, but still quite important. So what happened most recently sticks in our mind and influences our judgments more than what happened a bit before that. So if somebody, say your partner, makes a stinging remark, you're thinking about them and their attitude to you based on that remark, not on all the other nice things they've said to you previously. And that coming back to the left brain and absolutisation seems to have a close relationship there. Yeah, so we hang on to that stinging remark. That's what that person means at this moment, rather than the bigger picture of what they've meant to us over a longer period of time. And then another interesting one. I'm not going to go into all the possible ones, but this is another interesting one which affects our attention. That's the Zeigarnik effect, which was identified by, I think it's a Russian researcher called Zeigarnik, a female researcher, I think quite a way back, so 1920s or 30s, something like that, when there weren't that many female researchers. And she was working, I think it was somewhere in Central Europe, maybe Vienna or somewhere. Went into a restaurant with some colleagues, and there was this remarkable waiter who held very complicated set of orders in his head and knew exactly what everybody wanted and remembered little details like the exact type of garnish they wanted or whatever it was. Yeah, so this waiter was remarkable for his memory, in effect, of the orders. And then Zeigarnik left the restaurant and was discussing this with her colleagues and realised she'd left her scarf behind. So she went back into the restaurant and found the waiter who had been serving them and said, I think I left my scarf behind. So perhaps I left it behind where I was sitting. And the waiter said, where were you sitting? And Zeigarnik said, well, don't you remember where we were sitting when you remembered all these detailed orders and what we said? And the waiter said, well, I remember orders, when I'm taking orders and not a moment afterwards. Then I forget them. I forget everything about it. So this is, the Zeigarnik effect is a tendency that she spotted that actually we hold things in our memory and hold them in our attention, when they matter for our goals. And then we may let go of them completely. So again, it's a limitation in wider awareness of the things that may affect us. So again, it relates to this question of the left hemisphere sort of absolutising what's important to it at this moment, at this perhaps limited period of time, when it's important to fulfil these certain goals, sort out these people's order, make a good impression on them, get a good tip maybe, and then move on, forget that. Now, of course, we don't always manage that, and our left hemispheres can hang on in other ways. They can actually hang on to ideas of things that have happened in the past in other circumstances. It's all about what the goals are, and rather than that we always do this. But there are obviously some circumstances where we may let go of things too much. Our attention be limited in that sort of way. Okay, so we've got all these kinds of limitations on our attention, which are unavoidable, really, or a large component of them are unavoidable. They are about our embodied existence and experience, and what it's like to be an embodied, limited person. But there's the way we respond to them, which could be more or less extreme. So as I mentioned earlier this morning, you can have a very positive or a very negative, dogmatic response to these kinds of limitations. You can imagine that you've completely overcome them when you haven't, or you can ignore them completely, or rather you can believe that you are completely subject to them and can't do anything about them. But it seems much more likely that awareness of any of these kinds of limitations on our attention can actually help us to compensate in various ways for them. In other words, we can extend our awareness, and in doing so, we extend our attention. We may not do it in any large-scale way. Maybe if I was doing that experiment, I might not have spotted the man in the gorilla suit either. I don't know. But perhaps we can increase the probability that we would. So the kinds of limitations on our attention, you might think, sometimes we talk about people having tunnel vision, or metaphorically speaking, tunnel vision, or myopia, again, metaphorically, having a sort of limited view of things, and that limited view is basically a limitation in space, which is why I titled this talk Attention and Space. So we focus on a limited sphere of space, and we defend that limited attention by having rigid boundaries around it. So you might think of this sphere, whatever it is that we're interested in, sphere of attention, as being fortified. So we build castles around it. We keep bowmen guarding it. We make plans to keep out the enemy. And so what does this defence consist in? Well, often it consists in rigid beliefs about what's worthy of attention. So we're not looking for things, like the waiter who isn't interested in people who leave their scarves behind. That's not of relevance to him anymore. So he's got quite a simple kind of rigid belief about what his duty is there, which excludes further awareness. Or you might get somebody who's a member of a religious cult who believes that other people outside that cult are not saved by God, so therefore shouldn't be treated with kindness or engaged with fully. So it's all kind of fortification about what we give our attention to, or how we respond to things beyond it, or things that might intrude on that sphere of attention. So there's a close interaction really between this question of what we give our attention to and what we believe in, or what kinds of beliefs we hold. So you can't really separate all this stuff from some of the other things we're going to talk about later to do with beliefs that we might hold. Another example about how this might apply practically is things like stereotyping. So supposing you meet a new individual who's in a category of people who you might stereotype. So it might be race or gender or something classically speaking, or it might be any of a number of characteristics. But if you're going to stereotype that person, then you're only focusing on certain features of that person and taking that as that's the final story about what they are and what they're like. So that's going to determine everything else that you believe about that person. So in effect, you've adopted metaphysical beliefs about that person, beliefs which are not open to experience or further modification or questioning. And thenceforward, your attention, unless you challenge or change that metaphysical belief, your attention is limited to things that confirm that belief or are consistent with the model you've given yourself for what they're like. So that's obviously one aspect of the various aspects of experience that we're going to be looking at. But one thing I want to bring out in all these areas is what are practical responses. So before I finish this bit, I want to talk a bit about practical responses we could make, at least broadly speaking. Yeah, so things we can do about limitations of our attention and ways that we tend to fortify that limitation. So one thing is just awareness of cognitive biases. So awareness of some of the things I've been talking about, and just a few examples of cognitive biases that there really are loads of them. I know this because I've been researching the last few months. Hundreds, actually, of cognitive biases that have been identified by cognitive psychologists. So, it's a long job. Nobody's going to get to grips with it. I haven't got to grips with them practically anything like, but what I've been trying to do is improve my awareness of them. So perhaps we could start working with just a few of them and try and become aware of the fact that we have these biases, and that a little more awareness of those biases can help us to extend our awareness a little bit and overcome our limitations just a little bit. So a simple example will be what I said about the primacy effect earlier, that perhaps we could try and focus our attention on what happens next with the new person we're meeting, rather than the first impression they make on us. What's the second impression? Then critical thinking, really, or critical approach to beliefs. So this involves critical thinking skills, really. So these beliefs that we use to defend our limitations of awareness and attention. If we become aware of the limitations of those beliefs, that they may not be correct, I think that's closely associated with, a possibility of opening in our attention. Our attention may just go a bit further if we're aware that we haven't got it sewn up, that we don't know everything that's going on. But there's another thing to look out for there, is that a critical approach can itself become a closed and dogmatic approach. So it's easy to criticise one set of beliefs that are reinforcing those fortifications, only to create another set. And that's the relationship between positive and negative metaphysics in the middle way. So, for example, it's easy to criticise theological beliefs in religions, or beliefs based on the authority of God or something like this, only to swing to negative metaphysical beliefs about the non-existence of God, or the lack of any meaning in the beliefs that are held, or anything of that kind. That would also limit our attention in other ways, so that we weren't looking out for the positive elements in the beliefs we were rejecting. So a critical approach needs to be sceptical in the best sense, that is, trying to find this complex middle way between the positive and the negative. So it's not just a question of being rational or even being empirical or being logical. Those are the types of words we often tend to fall back on, as alternative, supposedly correct responses. But often what we label with these kinds of words is just another set of beliefs, which may just be a reaction from the previous ones. It may or may not, but you'd have to probe what we really mean by words like that. Then another possible practical response, meditation, I think, can help perhaps more directly with attention. Obviously, you'll have experienced this if you've practiced meditation, probably. Meditation, in many ways, is the direct cultivation of attention, particularly a practice like the mindfulness of breathing. It's just working quite directly on your habitual openness to stimuli, I think, to some extent. So that's possibly why, when you come out of meditation, you've got to be a bit careful with yourself. You don't want to suddenly expose yourself to a lot of stimulation, because that could be quite jarring. The regular long-term practice of meditation can have an impact on slightly increasing your attention and your perhaps ability to overcome some of these cognitive limitations. But we've probably got to think of it in the long term, rather than just, I have a great meditation experience, that come out in a wonderful state of mind. Because that state of mind may just be too open or not well adapted to the situation that we then emerge into. But over the long term, meditation can be a good way of working with attention. And in a way, I think also meditation loosens the boundaries in quite a direct way. And that may be because, well, particularly in something like the mindfulness of breathing, you're not working with objects and things that we think we've got sewn up. You're working with something, the ambiguity of the breath, or whatever your object of meditation is. It's probably something quite ambiguous and open, depending on the type of meditation you're doing, but quite often. Finally, area of work and on attention. I think the arts are really good here. So, I'm going to talk a bit more tomorrow about cognitive models, and that is ways in which we tend to think within particular metaphors or particular constructions of ideas of what it is we experience. But the great thing about the arts is, by working through the imagination, they can help us be aware of other possible constructions, other possible cognitive models. So they helped, in other words, to open our attention beyond the kind of selectivity that might limit what we're aware of otherwise. And that's maybe a bit of an abstract way of putting it. More directly, more concretely, you can just experience this by being asked to look at something and draw it, for example. So that's, I hope, links to what we'll be doing this evening. Norma, you're still okay with doing some drawing with us this evening? Yeah, and maybe challenging us to be aware of our cognitive biases about the things we're looking at or drawing. Okay, so I think, obviously I'll leave it to Norma to say more about this from her much greater experience of these things. But my understanding of this partly is that part of the way we can compensate for our limitations in attention when doing something like drawing is by shifting attention in some ways. Yeah, so perhaps you could draw the space around an object, for example, rather than drawing the object itself. And that's part of what I was trying to get at in the poem I read this morning, which might have been a bit abstract in places, but the main thing that's trying to get at, I think, is the importance of the space in which things exist, rather than just the things themselves. That there is a wider context for everything we think we're engaging with. So that's some links then, basically, between some of the things I've been talking about and areas of practice on which we can work with them. So I'll leave it there for now. So Any immediate questions or responses about any of that stuff?
I was a bit confused at times when you were using the word attention, when I would have used the word either perception or awareness. You were talking about, say, the primacy effect and how that affects our attention. Or doesn't affect, I wouldn't say it affecting our attention so much as it affecting our perception of something, because our attention is kind of where we consciously place our consciousness or our awareness. I'll use that when I meant attention. If you attend to something, whereas the primacy effect affects our perception of something, rather than the fact that we actually attend to it in the first place.
So are you making the point there that some of our perception, which might be having an effect in the primacy effect, is unconscious or may not be to do with our conscious attention?
It may or may not be, but that's what it kind of directly affects, whereas our
so perception
attention, what the agency behind their attention is kind of one step away from that.
So you're saying there that perception is a wider phenomenon basically than just attention, that there could be attentive perception maybe and more relatively unconscious.
Well, perception is what we then are aware of, but I don't see the primacy effect directly affecting our attention, because we can still maybe attend to whatever, but the primacy effect affects what we perceive. And whether we choose to attend to that perception or not is on a different level.
Yeah, I agree with you. That kind of processing is often unconscious and
it's a different faculty in the brain, I think, attention as opposed to perception.
But does that surely that doesn't affect the possibility of us working with it or of us making it more the object of attention?
Well, no, not at all, but I think it's via the perception rather than the attention. The effect has on the perception, not the effect has on our attention.
But there could still be an indirect effect on our attention. Yeah. So I think that's an important element of complexity we could bring in to be more adequate in our description there. That to take more account of the unconscious ways that the brain processing works. Yeah.
Because I think that's where we do, probably the only place in our brain that I can conceive that we actually have any agency is in what we choose to attend to in the first place.
Right. I'm sure I'd agree with that, just because of the indirectness of a lot of the ways that our intentions may come through. So we may set up something intentionally or with attention to start with, and then that has an unconscious effect later on, which alters our unconscious perceptions as well. Does that make sense?
And I don't quite follow it.
Well, if you try and think in a more compound way about the effects of what we choose to do or what we decide to do consciously, that what we choose to do may be to give a steer to our habits, in some way. So I like the image that Jonathan Haidt uses of an elephant, that we're like riding an elephant. The elephant largely goes its own way, but we can just give it a bit of a steer here and there. So if you give the elephant a bit of a steer in a slightly different direction, then it may just go and carry on by itself.
Sure.
But that fact that it's carrying on that direction rather than that is still, maybe completely unconscious by that point, but it's still effective your previous actions and the directions that you've moved it in.
But I think it just goes back to the first bit, sort of when you choose to decide, or you decide you choose to do something. Well, I'd say possibly we never choose to do anything. All we can do is choose to, to attend to what's happening.
Well, that brings up the whole question of free will and determinism, which is something I think it's an influential and the dichotomy of free will and determinism seems to have a strong negative effect to me on the discussion in contemporary society, particularly around ethics and our ethical responses. But I particularly want to get away from discussions that are dominated by the assumption either that we're free or that we're not, but just go back to the experience. Well, do we experience being responsible for our actions? do we experience being able to change what we do and how we respond to things? And if we do, that's what counts, rather than a deterministic or libertarian set of dogmas. And I think that's a crucial element of the middle way, actually, which I think is often missing in accounts of the middle way that I hear elsewhere. But that's one aspect of it which is quite, it's philosophically challenging, I think, to thoroughly try to avoid those two sets of assumptions, either of them.
When you say other kinds, because Buddhism doesn't come down on one side of free will or determinism, does it? And they take a middle way view in that as well, don't they? Quite often
it's just not very clear in my experience what Buddhists think about this, or they haven't really engaged with the question. So it's quite easy for a Buddhist from a Western background to adopt one or other of those standpoints unconsciously and apply it or project it onto Buddhist thinking, in my experience. So it could be a scientific naturalistic kind of view which assumes determinism, or it could be some kind of spirituality based or the religious view that assumes free will. And either of those can just get imposed on the kind of resources Buddhism gives people. Any other questions or thoughts from anyone else? I mean, how does this relate to your experience? Can you relate it to your experience of using and directing attention, for example?
The first one makes sense to me, the awareness of cognitive bias. I think that can be extremely useful. It's also rather daunting, because as you said, there are so many of them. Is your advice to start with the main ones first? Like, for example, you say the confirmation bias as an element of that in all dogmatic assumptions, or is that too broad to work on because it's such an overarching bias as well? When you're aware of them, is it best to break them up, or to start off with them, thinking them in a more broader sense?
I think both. But I think you end up with unhelpful limitations if you either just concentrate on analysis, break it down, as here's this particular cognitive bias, I can work with it in this situation. That can be helpful in some ways, but it may be too specific. It may not be adapted to other situations.
Okay.
And then, or there's the alternative, which is to say, well, it's all really one, and I'd kind of agree with that. Hence my the aphorism I put out on the internet a little while ago, which is there's only one cognitive bias, and that's basically absolutization or something on those lines. That this tendency to get stuck in a particular attitude, which may be a response to a particular cognitive bias, either on free will or determinism lines. But obviously that's a bit vague. If you just take that by itself, it doesn't help you with very specific practice. So there's some sort of balance to be struck, I think, between seeing it all as a whole, seeing them all as connected, and perhaps not being daunted by the sheer number and complexity of devices. Yeah. So maybe a helpful way in to think, well, actually, there's one central point here, and then I can start to engage with, maybe just a selection of the more specific ones with that in mind. And then gradually extend the number of cognitive biases that you try and become aware with or work with.
Yeah. I suppose that example I gave earlier about the negativity bias, knowing how specific that is, I was able to adopt a strategy to try and ameliorate that by looking at there's a site called Positive News, whereas if I just saw that as a confirmation bias or whatever, then I wouldn't be able to take that specific step.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's where I think the specific biases are useful. So like the Zeigarnik effect example, that's quite specific, isn't it? And we might be able to apply that. I don't know if in your guest house, do you have a similar thing where you're concentrating on a particular activity and then?
But I noticed that rang a bell with. I mentioned last night I'm a Samaritan, and I've now got a name for this idea, because we talk about this a lot. Often when you're on the phone and you're talking to someone, you're giving that person your complete attention, and you're really there with them, and then the phone rings, then you're on with someone else, and then if you try and reflect on the one before that first one, and then it's gone. Or you just have even though you've really been there, you've really engaged with a lot of detail, and it's just very immediate. You're very present in a sense, but when your attention shifts to another person, then you try and reflect back on that, and you remember very little. Yeah. Or I do anyway.
Yeah.
I've developed quite a firm conviction in relation to meditation and directing attention, that I could direct my attention more in a more sustained way, and in a more attentive way if I had my eyes open. And this was in meditation practice. I mentioned this on my blog in the forum. I'm not so sure about it now, Robert, but I did get a strong sense that I was more able to attend to my breath, and I was more able to attend to other experiences if I had my eyes open. I'm not so sure about that. But I've also found that I'm not very good at listening. I find it very difficult to maintain attention to someone speaking to me. It's quite a strain. I often either misunderstand or misinterpret what people have said. But I find that's less likely to happen if I have my eyes closed. I've noticed I've spoken about the war room at home and discussions at home where two people are talking and I'm trying to follow the conversation. If I shut my eyes, then I can give it more attention. I don't know whether I've chosen to do that because of early experiences or whether it's just the way I'm wired.
But you're limiting your attention there, aren't you, in order to focus more strongly in one direction. Yeah. I mean, I do the same if I want to listen to a piece of music, then I close my eyes. Right. I just focus on the piece of music. And it's so I think that there are points where we are more effective if we do limit our attention in a very deliberate way. But then the others, maybe your early example shows that we can be too specific. Like the way to, whether it's over time or it could be in terms of space as well, that we limit our attention a little too narrowly when it needs to be a bit broader. Yeah. And actually, even if you could bring in a bit of Buddhist tradition here, because there were two ways of talking about mindfulness, as I understand it, in the Buddhist tradition. So there's the immediate awareness or concentration. But there's also what's known as sampajana, which is more about sustained awareness over a period of time. So it's seems to be that you can focus too much on one to the exclusion of the other. There's another balance thing coming in here that you can get into a great state in meditation, but and you could be in the kind of situation Barry was talking about, where you're really focused on somebody who you need to focus on in a particular context, but you also need to carry that awareness over into a later experience and benefit from it in the future. Actually, I was thinking about this in relation to travelling, because recently I was travelling in Germany, and some of that was looking at cultural sites, particularly art galleries and churches and things, and I found actually that as I had previously when travelling, that it's actually quite easy to focus just on those things that you've got in front of you, and then after a while it turns into a sort of blur that you forget about the specifics, which actually you were benefiting from at the time or getting something out of at the time. So that I needed to go through a deliberate process of recall. Well, that day I went there and I saw this and I had this kind of experience in relation to this particular church or this painting or whatever it was I'd seen, And that process of recall is not just for its own sake, but in order to relate the experiences to each other, I needed that recall and that kind of sustained attention rather than just focused attention.
Mm.
And that meant that I can end up more with a sort of awareness of what I've gained from the trip as a whole and bringing the different elements together, synthesizing them.
So you're kind of revisiting something in your mind that you've seen before.
Yeah.
And it gives you a different perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah. And that, I think that could be part of the value of photos, even if they're just snapshots. I use them as memory joggers.
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, they seem to be distractions. That I think there's been some experiment which showed that when people took a photo of things, they remembered it less well. But we can use these things also for reinforcement rather than just as distractions.
Milan Kundera, one of his aphorisms was "Einmal ist kein Mal."
Right.
When you go and see something like a cathedral, if you go back the next day and look at it, it's a different experience, isn't it?
Right. Yeah.
I often find if I do go to a cultural site, it is very beneficial to go back a second time, and then it has a different kind of effect on you.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Especially after an interval, perhaps then you've got a different.
But you can go back the next day, to be honest.
Yeah. And that may reveal how little we really took in the first time, in a sense.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, John? Does this stuff relate to your experience?
Yeah, but of course, of course it relates to it. So my thought, really, this is probably just a bit too black and white, but you mentioned about limited senses as being something that affects attention, and I guess my question on that would be, do you think then that all logic and reason is up for debate, actually, and that any scientifically proven stuff you can sort of question because it is just all down to the limited senses available to people?
Yeah, it's all open to question. It's a question of also what further conclusions you draw from that. So that doesn't mean that it's not valuable and informative, or that we shouldn't have, which doesn't repose confidence in it for the time being. So again, that seems an important aspect of the middle way to me, actually, that we can be confident in what our experience consistently tells us so far, because that's the best information we have. We should be comparing that with an absolute that we not only don't have but can't have, and saying, well, therefore this is just relative, or this is not worthwhile. But at the same time, I don't think there's any grounds to absolutize scientific theories or even scientific laws, as they've sometimes been labelled. I think there's debate in science about whether there really are scientific laws in the sense of certainties about the universe. So that's where I think skepticism, in the sense of a balanced perspective questioning both positive and negative certainties, comes in our view of science as well as our views of other areas of experience.
You can often see a bias throughout history with skepticism, that when there's the recognition that we can't know everything, or we're not certain about things, then there's a tendency to say, well, we know nothing, and go to the opposite extreme.
Most scientists that I listen to say this is what we know now, that it could change in the future. I think it's a healthy view.
Yeah, so obviously that's in many cases that's the sort of healthy effect of scientific method, and the way that scientific methods encourage people to be provisional in their assessment of things. But there can also be philosophical assumptions creeping into the way people interpret science and its findings. So I think we need to try and separate those from the scientific method as a helpful way of engaging with experience.
I think you express it well, Robert. Rather than saying we do not know, and it's better to say we may not know.
Sure. Yeah. I mean that makes the point that these things which are believed about the universe, whether it's Newton's laws or, whatever the scientific theory is, that, they may be true. And there may be, in some cases, we could even say there's 99.99% certainty about them, in the sense that we've got so little reason to question them in some cases, or at least not to question them within certain parameters or certain areas of experience. But that doesn't mean that they're certainties. There's still an important difference between a certainty and a 99.9% confidence.
But quantum physicists, they say they have to go back to the drawing board because so many things are being turned over, and they've got to sort of look again, being shaken in what they thought they knew.
Perhaps Martin could give a...
But at the end of the day, Newtonian physics is good enough to keep the aeroplanes flying, isn't it? Which is kind of what we worry about.
Yes.
That's a good example as well, that just because quantum physics came along with arguably a way of describing the world that addressed conditions better, that's not to say you threw the baby out with the bathwater with Newtonian physics. You can build a bridge with a Newtonian physics, or describe the parabola of a ball flying through the air, or the planets orbiting the sun perfectly well with Newton.
Well, not perfectly well, but
not true.
Not quite
very well.
Very
well.
Yes.
Which brings us back to the initial point about the relationship between our beliefs and our goals. Well enough for what? For the goals that we have, for the uses to which we put scientific understanding. Whether that's uses that we normally think of as descriptive, like just providing a scientific account of the world that satisfies us. That's also a goal that science can fulfill, as well as obviously technological applications and so on.